Cool.
Welcome to Deprogrammed on Unsafe Space. My name is Carter Laren. I am joined by the Bad Mama Jamma, my co-host, Keri Smith. As always, Keri, say hi.
Hi, guys. Hello.
You can follow us on YouTube. You can go to Unsafe Space channel on YouTube. Twitter, we're Unsafe Space Co. Because our URL is unsafespace.co, not .com. The M stands for Marxism, and we have none of that. So today we are joined by, so sorry everyone if we're an hour early. So if you're seeing this rebroadcast and you expected to see it live, tough. We screwed up our time zone.
I screwed up time zones. It's my fault.
I don't think we should pass blame, Keri.
Yeah.
It's probably just I think Zach has time zone privilege. We can talk about that later. So we're joined today by Zach Hing. Zach's an online social and political commentator, digital strategist, and performer. After he released several videos on YouTube that went viral, he became one of the most prominent and exciting personalities on YouTube due to his ability to articulate his thoughts reasonably while remaining authentic and connecting with people from a variety of different backgrounds. He first rose to prominence as a Walkaway member. So that's mostly what we're going to talk about today. Zach, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you, Carter and Keri, for having me on Unsafe Space.
What's the best way for people to follow you and follow your work, and where do you want them? Twitter, YouTube, Facebook?
Honestly, just YouTube. Twitter is kind of, I'm just on there because I need to be. And then Facebook, I don't encourage people to do it just because I don't have a Facebook page. I have a Facebook profile, which I should tell people not to go to. But YouTube is the best place right now. It's where all the content is up to date, and yeah, that's where I'm the most active. So
till they kick you off, man, someday.
Till they kick me off, that's right. I would have to find my own platform.
So tell us your story. You were actually in the Berkeley area during the I guess the 2017 Battle of Berkeley, the Milo stuff, which actually incidentally also sparked me to start doing some other stuff as well. But what's your story? What were you up to, and what happened? I know you've talked about it before, so yeah, I'll just give you the floor and let you kind of tell us in your own words.
Yeah, the story never gets old. And the thing is, there have been multiple instances, right, politically that led up to that point. For me personally, after Trump got elected in early 2017, and in that time period, even just before, right between he was inaugurated and when Milo was staging some talks at Berkeley, this was not just something that was specific to Milo. I think it erupted over Milo because of his, volatility and his reputation as a provocateur. But this was happening to people like Ben Shapiro and Ann Coulter, folks who were also scheduled to speak at UC Berkeley, I think in early 2017. And, interestingly enough, every time I tell this story, I start to actually think a little bit about the steps on how I got to this point. I started just looking things up a little bit more. And the interesting thing is, this didn't start with like Milo necessarily, or even the inauguration of Trump, but because I had values that I held close to my heart, things surrounding being more pro-life and especially defending free speech. I think that's the superficial kicker for me, is when free speech gets threatened, especially when there is violence surrounding it. That's the last straw for me. So I had my conservative values, right? I obviously was more left-leaning and all that, simply because, living in the Bay Area and fostering a lot of progressive beliefs are essentially all that's around you. And I wasn't very outspoken about it, so I nodded my head and went along with it. With Milo, in February, what had happened was Antifa and a lot of other folks, it was probably also, university students, started to protest in a little bit more of a violent manner than prior protests. It's one thing to have Black Lives Matter protests in the streets, which I'm kind of like, all right, whatever, you do your thing. You have that First Amendment right. But it's another thing when people are setting things on fire, And
And
what's that?
Was this February? You said February. Was this 2017, right?
Yeah, 2017. So this was a little over a year before Walkaway. And the thing is, when free speech started to get threatened to that level, I spoke to some of my friends about it because, this was Berkeley. Berkeley was 2 miles down the road from where we live. I'm like, you know what's going on at UC Berkeley right now? Like, people are protesting like crazy. And weirdly enough, people like Milo Yiannopoulos and Ben Shapiro were folks that I was kind of paying attention to. I still thought Milo was a little bit too provocative for me, not because of what he had to say, but because of what everybody else was saying about him. So that's the interesting thing. So after that, I was like, okay, who's this Milo guy, and who are these folks that these people are trying to suppress so thoroughly? And when I think there were a few videos. There was Milo's rather comedic approach to anti-feminism. Ben's talking points surrounding abortion, and just generally a lot of these pundits in their conservation of free speech. And as I listened to it, I've always believed in free speech. Even as a liberal, I was always just like, no, we need free speech. Like, people need to have discussions. It's something that I still carry with me to this day. So I wouldn't say that, I was intolerant one day and then tolerant the next day. I've always wanted that. I just was a little bit more progressively oriented. But anyways, back to Milo. I know it's a long story, but this is good because I get oddly specific with it now that people ask. I found out about them, and it just opened up. It was just a big rabbit hole I started going down, and a lot of it's made a lot of sense because they reaffirmed beliefs that I've had, and I was also in a place where, even as a liberal, I never agreed with feminism. I never agreed with that. So sometimes your entryway into these ideas start from a place where it's uniform, right? Even as a leftist, more progressive oriented, I wasn't for feminism. I saw a lot of hypocrisy in it. I also just didn't like that people just whined about everything. So already, in a weird way, it spoke to already existing, I would say, bias that I had. But sometimes that's a good thing because that's how people find their ways in. As I learn about how people find things out, it appeals to you in a point in your life where that is prominent. Like, annoying feminazis in the Bay Area are never ending, and I was sick of them. Even as a leftist, I was already sick of that. So when Milo talked about that, I was like, oh, this is funny. I'm just gonna keep these videos. And then more and more, I was introduced to other people, and their ideas were more in line with the ideas that I've had and the ideas that I've always really what I was raised on. But then, I was scared. All of 2017, I kept my beliefs to myself. I really did. I was kind of like,
so I want to talk about that for a minute, because I don't think people get that, Zach. Like, I think so. A lot of people, I'm older than you by years. When we went to college, I'm sorry, Keri, I'm looping you in with old people. When we went to college, there was political disagreement, but I don't think I felt so much pressure to shut up if I disagreed with the mainstream narrative. Like, there were people that were on the other side of me politically, and maybe they didn't like me, but the average person in college was like, I wrote for the school newspaper, so like, oh, you're that guy, okay, fine, whatever. Like, there was no, you're a Nazi or you're an evil person because you wrote an article we don't like, or you're not in lockstep with our beliefs. But my understanding is that's not the case anymore. And you're fresh out of school. Can you tell us what the social pressure is like?
Yeah, and I think that timing and circumstance has a lot to do with that. I say that because had I come out and talked about conservatism in 2015, it's very, very different. There was something that happened after Trump got elected that all of a sudden made it a crime to defend free speech, to even talk about how great America would be. So that's the thing, is that Trump is an excuse. He's an excuse for a lot of things that you can't talk about because of the fact that he was elected not on his own merit, but due to the fact that the rhetoric now is he was elected due to racism and prejudice in this country is completely misinformed, right? So you're automatically tied to right-wing ideology because Trump supports that. Now, I've said many times that I don't always agree with everything our president says, but that being said, we can read between the lines a little bit more. So to take it back to college, there's the whole post-Trump America and being a conservative, right? Because you get grouped in. And it would have been very different if, say, Obama was still president and I had been at the time, say in 2015, say in my second or third year of college, been more of like a college Republican or more of a conservative. That being said, I don't think it would, the reactions would have been as polarizing. But when I think about the close friendships that I had, I mean, this is Oakland, this is San Francisco, this is anything, the whole demonizing white people and the misconstrued aspect of the Civil Rights Act and slavery as a whole, like all of that were all such familiar, heavily ingrained talking points that I think that even saying it wouldn't have prompted a lot of insightful discussion. I don't think I would have been hated, but I don't think it would have been encouraged. Like I think, because right now a lot of young leftists, they just check out. You know, there's no discussion. I find that even older liberals, right? People that are 10 years my senior, that are actually, they're progressives, and I don't agree with a lot of what they say. At least we can talk. But younger folks now check out very, very quickly out of the discussion. And if you mention anything, anything that goes against the rhetoric of racism as we interpret it in this country today, that's not something that they're even willing to talk about. It's almost a no-fly zone. Like,
why is that?
You're responsible for slavery. We're not talking about it, huh?
Why is that? Why do you think that is?
I think that it has a lot to do with a few things. I think when it comes to access to information, it's number one in our culture, it's very, very heavily pushed upon us. You know, when movies and pop culture already start to follow that narrative, right? Then all of a sudden, I think the collectivist mindset for a lot of young people is to conform. People just want to fit in. And I tie that. But
college traditionally was always that this was the time when you like questioned authority and whatever. And
yeah,
like,
well, you know what?
We've got college kids that are like, yay, authority, except for Trump. But,
right. But I mean, were safe spaces a real mandated thing when you were going to college? I mean, that's a thing here. So that's what I'm saying is that something shifted where I usually credit a couple things, and these are theories, and people can disagree with me on this. I think that there's a parenting issue. I spoke about this briefly with just a lot of younger millennial folks. And then I think that there's just this economic pressure that's also tied into the institution that you basically swore your life away to. So when I say things that hit you on certain pain points, this is what progressives preach, right? Student loan consolidation and all for loan debt forgiveness. It's like, who's paying for all of this? So when you hear things like that, and you hear that you are disadvantaged economically because of your race, it's already going to hit on certain pain points in your life that you're going through. And so all of a sudden, you're just going to nod your head and go, yeah, great, socialism. You know, that's why people in Berkeley love communism. There's a coffee shop that I live next to on Fruitvale that didn't serve cops and had like Che Guevara posters openly on the shop. And
because murdering gay people is fun and cool.
But that's the thing.
That's not what we're supposed to like about Che.
I know that's the thing. It's selective ignorance, right? You kind of go off of what you like, and I think that take something very, very particular like white privilege or whatever. It's when people want to look at it from an isolated standpoint, I can see that prejudice will still exist between individuals. I don't think we're post-racial as a society. I really don't think we are. But that being said, it's not a reason. It's not a reason for why people are held back. And it's also not a singular reason for why people act the way they do. People have been taught to behave a certain way, to not think for themselves. And to go back to why do you think college, when you ask me, why do I think colleges are like this now? I think that number one, it's a parenting thing. And I think number two, it's an economics thing. So,
I mean, in fairness to your generation, you were kind of screwed over by previous generations quite a lot. I mean, if we look at, I mean, we could probably do a whole show on how baby boomers suck, but you know, if you look at what they did to the country, they basically they basically racked up bills that you're going to have to pay for and are paying for in taxes in the future. So they could enjoy Social Security and a whole bunch of other benefits that they never actually paid enough into to warrant. And then they spent the money that they were supposedly putting aside. So they've kind of wreaked havoc on the economy, but they've also sold you, I think, this bill of lies with respect to college, which is, hey, you know, pay. It's worth $150,000 for 4 or 5 years of your life to go to college because you'll get a good job, and that's just not true anymore. And if you look at the state of the education system, you know, aside from college, it's gone downhill precipitously. But college in particular, you've got these kids graduating with, you know, you may or may not have student loans, but a lot of kids have huge student loans, and they're not even worth minimum wage at Starbucks because they haven't learned anything. And that's not fair to them either. So they're in this situation where that college debt seems quite burdensome because it's not like they're getting out and getting jobs that are lucrative and they know they're going to pay it off. The economy's tough. They're getting out, and it's a hard thing to pay off those student loans. And so when Bernie comes along and says free college, I guess that kind of makes sense. And they're not really teaching economics or any well, you tell me, are they teaching any kind of Enlightenment values or anything that would help you understand the pitfalls of communism or socialism or collectivism or the importance of individualism historically, or do they just gloss over all that and have Che Guevara posters?
I think you mentioned a lot of things, and I think that it's not specific to any one thing that you're taught in school. Like I said, it's selective ignorance. So you can talk about how bad socialism is, right, up to a point. When I say selective ignorance, I mean when it gets to anything that is race related, that's where it falls short. Now, I'll give an example of this. One thing that you're taught in United States history is not something I was taught in college, but what a typical rundown would be is the burden of proof of who's responsible for something like slavery. And this is something that's rather controversial, but I'm not the first person to look at this differently. You know, when we talk about like the issues surrounding this, right? Not just from an economic standpoint, but also like a real American standpoint, you'll find that race may have had a contingency with that, but it has very little to do with just the outplay of history. You know, one thing that I had to investigate on my own that I learned recently was the popular argument is, okay, America is a racist society, right? It's easy to hear that and go, yeah, we've oppressed black people. I mean, when I say we, I'm talking about white people, no offense. But and
you're talking about actually about 4% of the population who owned slaves, but
right. So there's that, right? And that's a data point. That's not something that prejudice or bias is going to refute. That's a data point, 4% of the population. And that's what I'm trying to illustrate here is that the empirical nature of facts and data in history is construed. Like I said, it's selective ignorance. They teach you everything up to a point, but just enough so you harbor some prejudice. But then, you know, you forget other things. When people say the founding fathers were racist, they were slave owners, you couldn't legally release your slaves even if you wanted to. You know why? Because King George III still had limits on what you could do. The original draft of the Declaration of Independence included criticisms of King George and the fact that he allowed for the African slave trade to continue on as long as it did. So it's not that they wanted slavery. They were actively fighting the end it. We think of history as Abraham Lincoln came and with the Emancipation Proclamation started the movement that would abolish slavery, when in reality, Jefferson was working towards that. Madison was working towards that. The Northwest Ordinance, which outlawed slavery in a lot of the northern territories, not even states. They weren't states at the time. That happened 60 years before Lincoln. So when we talk
go ahead.
It's like, how can we talk about America being such a racist society and all white people being responsible for this when people were actively in concentrated efforts trying to abolish it? And a lot of the reasons for why the South maintained slavery as it did was because of agricultural outputs. There's an economic advantage. There was no tobacco plantations in the North because the climate doesn't accommodate for plantation farming. So sugar plantations, tobacco. So when you start to look at things for how they really are, calling a spade a spade. I mean, here's the thing also that you say this in a classroom, they'll hate you for it. But it's like to go after your own slave, to kill them or to lynch them would be a bigger economic burden on you than even setting them free. That's like one of those crazy things that you say that in a classroom because it doesn't fit the whole white people oppress slaves forever rhetoric. And that's what I'm saying. When you battle it on with exactly what happened in facts, you know, legislation that was proposed years before Lincoln, all of a sudden it shakes things up a little bit. It's like, well, now it's not all white people. And now, okay, so what was the original goal of what we call certain unalienable rights and all men are created equals? It starts to shake things up. And that's the point. There's not, you know, any one person is to blame when cultures have been doing this to each other for centuries. But it does make people go, okay, now I cannot be selectively ignorant of one thing. The standard has to.
So this is interesting. So you're bringing up a couple things. I just want to pause because you're like, there's two really big underlying issues that you're bringing up here. One is this idea of judging people historically based on modern standards, and the other one is judging people as collectives. But let's talk about this historical judgment thing because. We hear this a lot, but you don't hear it it's selectively applied who you judge historically, right? And how you judge them historically. No one is arguing that a lot of the people who built Western civilization had very vile beliefs and did horrible things. But you have to couch that with most people through most history had vile beliefs and did horrible things. As you alluded to, slavery was normal. Blacks in Africa caught other blacks and sold them to passersby. The Muslim slave trade was much bigger than the Christian Western slave trade. But no one talks about that. Slavery was horrible, but it's used only as a weapon against anyone who seems to be a figure in, I would say, Western civilization or American culture historically, right? They don't use it against anyone else, right? No one talks about how horrible Muhammad was. Right?
Yeah, any critique of Islam is deemed Islamophobic, but yeah.
Right. But, you know, certainly, I guess a 9-year-old bride doesn't sound particularly consensual to me. You could go after Muhammad on plenty of moral counts, but they don't. So they're viewing this. They're applying these standards, but to me that just seems like it's intentionally dishonest. Do you think is it that they don't know that this doesn't make any sense, or is it like an intentionally dishonest thing? It's hard for me to imagine someone applying those standards and not seeing how ridiculous that is. I mean, I don't know. You tell me.
I agree. I think that it's a number of different things. Like, look at just a most recent case with Jussie Smollett, right? Which I don't cover because everyone's covering it. When you have to now fabricate oppression to highlight a point. I'm not saying he's trying to get attention or anything, but when you have to fabricate your own oppression, actually construe a hoax to basically deliver a point, which is MAGA supporters are racist, right? That, I think, says something about where people are mentally as far as how far they're willing to go to utilize prejudice and milk it for every drop that they can. So I think that the people who know these things know it. I think that the people that the progressives, people who are in power, who know how to use race to bait people, know these things. I think that they know it better than we do. It's how the same people who run big socialist, big government regimes, even Hitler and Mao, they took that similar standpoint where you take people's prejudice, you take the have-nots of people, and you use that against them. You do. You say, hey, the reason why you're not doing well right now is because of insert person here, victim here, right? Collectivist thinking.
Right.
It's easier to blanket people as a whole and deem them responsible for a certain thing that has happened to another group of people than it is to evaluate each individual on they are. Now, if you want to evaluate each individual, that's obviously not realistic, but we have laws that create it to make it as egalitarian as possible. Now, equal outcome is impossible because everybody knows that opportunities, genetics, and all that are distributed unequally. But what we can see consistently throughout history is that when people have been evaluated on a more collectivist type thinking, I mean, look at what has happened, right? When one man is able to convince, a whole country from within that a certain middleman minority are deemed inferior because they may be superior in certain things, it's the same weapon that people use. So to answer your question, I think that people know these things, but I think that out of just, it could be selfishness, it could be, like I said, selective ignorance. They don't really care. How can you, like, I use
is it psychological? Is it back to your parenting issue where they parented, they have trauma or something, and they're latching onto something emotionally, or what?
I think so. I think it's a parenting thing partly. I think it's just a lack of accountability, right? And I think that, people obviously don't give like boomers credit and everything, but like, you were serving in world wars, and you came back and you provided for your family, and I think that there's a degree of what's the word I'm looking for? There's a bit of grit.
Well, there's some dignity in that, and there's some pride in that. I mean, there's certainly some good things about boomers, and I would say one of those things is they certainly were stronger people in terms of their moral and emotional strength. All right, and they hand you a rifle and send you to Germany. That's not something that's easy to do. And even if you just look at how people treated each other in society, they were much less emotionally indulgent. But
I think that it's a delicate balance. And I'll be honest with you, Carter, I don't have an answer. I don't have a pinpoint on what I think is the leading cause for maybe psychological dishonesty. But, like when people go about fabricating things just to get their point across and satisfy their own means, I think that in itself is enough evidence to say that people are willing to be intellectually and morally dishonest.
It seems like it hits a critical mass, though, in a group or in a situation like at a university or something, or in a college, where if enough people kind of buy into that collective emotional delusion or that kind of epistemology where what they feel is more important than what they think. Once there's that critical mass, it's then it gets very, very difficult to oppose it then, and you get more people caught up in that, right? Or at least, or you're quietly. I mean, you were quiet about stuff. How many people do you think in the Bay Area are silent about their disapproval or disagreement of these things, but terrified to speak up?
Well, many. And the nice thing about the channel is that all these so-called closeted conservatives, even closeted centrists, like, some people who aren't even right-wing. And I know Keri's mentioned this in the past. Keri, I don't know if you're still more liberal, more of a, centrist. I mean, again, labels are so interchangeable that forgive me if I'm misconstruing. And I personally don't like labeling.
No, I actually, I do consider myself to be liberal. And I was going to say, Zach and I actually met. The first time we met was at this Walkaway march that was organized by Brandon Strack. Is that how you say his last name?
Yeah.
And we were there doing an interview with Gavin McGinnis. And what I liked about the panel, because they had like 7 of us on the panel, and it was so ideologically diverse. So you have this group of people who are walking away, but not all of them are, like Brandon became a Republican, but I didn't become a Republican. Like there were different viewpoints represented who were just leaving. The way I look at it is some people left the left entirely, and maybe that is you, Zach. Some people left a certain portion of the left, like the SJW left. But we all left the SJW left. I'll put it that way. We all left that part, and then some of us left entirely. But yeah.
And I think I can empathize and understand when people still hold on to beliefs that may not always be what I would see as proven in facts. Like if you feel because it's one thing to feel a certain way, and even though I'm a facts over feelings type guy, I can empathize. You know, it's like if you're really coming from a place of a disadvantage, I can understand the need for social programs that may help you get you back on your feet. I will not be the first to say no. Well, let's do away with that because entitlement programs are the reason why people, you know, don't do anything with their lives. I won't say that in an absolute term, but there's a difference between doing that and then being dishonest and hypocrisy and eliminating the discussion completely. I think I can collectively say for most of us from Walkaway are the things that we all had in common rather than the beliefs itself. It's more of the fact that people check out on college campuses. They say, no, shut up, bye, I don't want to talk. Like, that is what we don't like.
So is it a lack of, sorry, go ahead, Keri, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so one of the things I liked about your Walkaway video was that you talked about how when the Walkaway movement happened, you realized that you weren't the only one, that you had this, you were so grateful for it, for, you know, and that I think is why you see such an outpouring of support, is because you have all these people out there who are figuring this out on their own and are figuring out, hey, there's something wrong with this belief system. It claims to be anti-racism or anti-sexism, but it's actually the opposite. But people were like quietly thinking maybe they're the only one who has these thoughts. I know I thought that at first as well. Can you talk just a little bit about that, about like what that was like to find that community? And do you think, I'm sure you've seen this as well, but do you think that the bubble on the left is going to be surprised that Walkaway is real in 2020? Because they say it's all Russian bots. They don't believe that you exist.
You look very Russian. I should never do accents. Shoot me, Keri.
I think how it felt was fantastic. I mean, it gave me the courage to enter into a sphere. Now, the thing is, it's not like it was real in the sense that I knew somebody tangible next to me who felt the same way, but I knew that there were enough people that were at a similar place of being disillusioned that in itself was enough to make me decide to express my views. And that's the crazy thing about Walkaway, is that unlike other political movements, right? What's the one thing that it has that a lot of movements seemingly latch onto is the fact that you don't have to, I mean, you could be a leftist, you could be a feminist, you could be an independent or a centrist. The fact that it's not mentioned is the point. It's your own way of thinking. You're walking away from something that you did not agree with. And the best part about it is that that is okay. There is no punishment for doing so. That, I think, is why Walkaway spoke in volumes to people both young and old, whatever race you were. I mean,
just walking away from ideological thinking, it sounds like what you're saying.
I think it's walking away from it's more about embracing your own beliefs, right? And I think that that can only happen because I think if there's one thing that I wouldn't say it's a shared belief, but a shared value that everybody had was, let's talk about it. That's it. First Amendment right. You know, the First Amendment in the Constitution, which was, as long as we can talk about it, I don't have to agree with you. And that's okay. We can coexist in this big ideological melting pot we call America. But the problem I think most people have in 2017, 2018 was the fact that you weren't even allowed to do that. You were shut down. You were silent before you could do it. And that's why,
I mean, do you think Antifa's to I mean, I don't want to interrupt, but I think Antifa's to credit for this. Like it's the people who turned violent that I think turned a lot of people like you on. I know a lot of people who had the freedom of speech as that was their last straw, right? And it was like, and they had said this for decades. As long as we have the freedom of speech, at least we can work stuff out, and like it's still a free country and we'll be able to solve our problems. But when people started pepper spraying people and hitting them with bike locks and burning stuff and shutting people down from having discussions, I think a lot of people woke up and went, wait a minute, where we've crossed the last straw, we need to be able to talk. Mm-hmm. And honestly, that's how Keri and I got together. At first, it was just like, can we just talk? Like, do we both agree that talking about stuff is okay? Do you credit Antifa with kind of starting this Walkaway? Because I think I might. I don't know.
Antifa paints a more obvious, I would say it's a tangible image that you can latch onto as being, well, let's not be like that. I don't want that. But I think Antifa is just an extended arm of a political system that basically is out to shut you down before you're given the opportunity to do so. And that's the thing. They're not shutting you down with healthy debate. They're shutting you down with literally removing your right to even speak. When it's violent, like, I mean, I am not for the ideology that was pushed forth by a lot of these right wingers in Charlottesville, but they didn't even have the chance to speak. Yeah, I don't agree with crazy identitarian beliefs of that nature, but it's like, go and talk about it. You want to get together with some of your buddies in a park and talk about it, and it may not be very popular in American opinion, fine. As a matter of fact, I'd encourage you to do that as opposed to resort to shooting up schools or anything. You want to go do that, go do that. And that's the problem is Antifa gives us a very obvious it's like a weaponized attack against free speech, but it's just a byproduct of the inability to foster discussion. Like a kid throwing a tantrum, right? If he can't talk it out with you, he's gonna throw things around and act very imbecilic. And I think that's what Antifa does. It's like a child that's, I said this on Gavin's show, it's like a child that's never been spanked. Talk about it. Why don't you be an adult?
Well, but I'm opposed to corporal punishment for children, so we won't get into that. But
anywho, metaphorically.
I think it's interesting, when you talk about kids, you're making me think about just examples that you have to set for children. And one example I think is that if you are honest and moral and just in your beliefs, and you're not hiding them, or you don't have an ulterior motive, or you're not just a power luster who's using beliefs to manipulate people dishonestly, if you're honest and just, you are not afraid to hear, or for other people to hear, arguments against your viewpoint. You welcome those arguments, even if they're horrible, even if it's the crazy people saying stuff that you completely disagree with, because you're confident that your arguments prevail, right? If you're actually intellectually honest, you have a sense of confidence that either your arguments will prevail or they're right and they'll convince you. But it doesn't matter. Bad ideas need to be exposed and talked about, and you're not afraid of them. And what we're seeing from the left is it seems like a fear, a deep-seated fear of any ideas, some of which are horrible, but even ideas that aren't, but anything that goes against what their ideology, it's a deep-seated fear. And like you said, it seems to have been triggered when they lost political power, when Trump got elected and they were suddenly out of power. It seems to trigger this massive emotional response that seems like it's just fear. Is that how you would characterize it, or am I way off base?
I think that there's some validity to that. I wouldn't say it's necessarily fear. I think it's more like butthurt, really, because it's just like you know what I mean, right? Every major news outlet, every major platform of influence was calling Hillary, and I think that when Trump
it's shame, like faith saving, or is that what you're saying? Like,
I would say to a degree. You know why? And this is there's evidence of this just in the way individuals under that leftist rhetoric behave. Because here's the thing, if you really were coming into it with facts, right, and you wanted to have a discussion, therefore you also have to cast aside some of your already existing bias and prejudice. And as a result, humility is also a thing. I'm okay to being schooled by a liberal about something I don't understand. But here's the thing, when you go into it with, I'm not going to talk about it because I must be right, then all of a sudden you don't accept the terms of debate. You don't accept the terms of civil discourse. And behaving like this isn't discussion. What I'm also trying to illustrate is we see that behavior with the refusal to acknowledge any good things that are coming out of the Trump administration. Like I said, I don't always agree with whatever he says, and I may not always agree with everything he pushes past his desk and everything that he signs. But sometimes people need to be able to say, okay, let's have a discussion about it. And even if I'm wrong, I can still maintain my dignity. You know, that's the thing. It's all perspective, right? But people don't like that. People don't like, I don't blame you. People don't like being wrong. You know, in debates, especially anything politically oriented, that's the one place to lose a debate, right? We can debate about pop culture, but it's okay if you lose in that, because for some weird reason, it's not like your values are being challenged. With politics, I think it spurs something else in people.
Well, I think it's the difference between ideology and critical thinking, because a critical thinker is wed to the idea of rooting out the truth. And that means in themselves, in their own thoughts, and in others. And so if I debate you, I'll put myself in the critical thinker category. If I debate you and you make a good argument and school me on something, I feel like that's a win for me. Like, oh, good.
Right.
I learned something. But if I'm wed to my, and my ego doesn't take a hit because I'm not wed to my ideology, I'm wed to the process of rooting out the truth.
Right.
But if your ego is tied to the ideology, it can be very painful to hear counter arguments and facts that go against what you're saying or whatever.
And I think that you hit the nail on the head. I think that there's too much, you could say, emotional tying to it, which, you know, creates this. It's the same driving force that makes people pathological liars and makes people over dependent on emotion to justify any kind of point. So sometimes for a lot of these people, refusal to take part in discussion and retaliation with violence may be a means to just not to have anything to do with it. So, you know, it's divisive, and unfortunately, I still think that a diplomatic way of going about talking to people is a way to do it, but I just don't think that, you know, shoving talking points down their throats is the way to do it. I think, you know, if I have this idea, it's like if I ever went to a Planned Parenthood and they were standing out about why Planned Parenthood should stay and being pro-choice, I'd probably go out there and like bring them some water or something. Like, you guys have been standing out here for a long time. Why is it that you believe what you believe? You see, I think, and I've done that with people, and I've noticed that, like, that's all people want. Like, I still care about people regardless of what they believe in, but like, I don't know, give value to them first. You know, if you can demonstrate that you're not just after them to win an argument of egos and headbutting, and come at it from a perspective of a sensible person. I mean, some people are pretty far gone, but I would like to think that there's still sensible people out there, but they just kind of sleepwalk through their values because that's all they know. Some people don't critical think. They just don't, you know. I think for people like us who do, it's like, I get it, but some people flat out do not critical think. They don't.
Yeah, you've mentioned facts a couple of times, and I just want to throw this out there because I think both sides talk about facts, because you can always cherry pick facts and find some data to support your side. I think one thing that I don't see being, I don't know if it's not being taught or just people aren't doing it, but there's this lack of understanding that facts have context and that they need to be integrated into a non-contradictory system of beliefs, right? So you can't just be like, I'm going to cherry pick this fact, even though it is like totally flies in the face of this other thing I believe in this other area, or doesn't jive with these other facts, or like there's no, you know, and not without system integration, you end up with a lot of internal contradictions. And there seems to be no, at least from the social justice perspective, and I've never been in the SJW camp. You and Keri both have been closer there, but there seems to be disregard for internal consistency with respect to belief systems.
I think that that's the case. I think that you're right about facts being cherry picked, because when there's already, in a weird way, of some kind of an agenda, it's hard to ignore that, right? It's hard to do that. I think that with the case of dealing with SJWs, there's a lot of claims, right? There's a lot of big claims without any real regard to any kind of potential objections to that, right? Because when met with opposition, the reaction is not really to talk about it. It's more to just respond with the same thing, but louder. What I'm trying to say is I think that going forward, what I could take away from even dealing with SJWs or even just living in my own echo chamber sometimes, which I don't think is always a good thing. You know, that's why I like, you know, it's good to freshen it up with people who don't feel the same way I do. By saying how I think having a solution as to how something could work or not work is a way to incentivize people to kind of go, I see where you're coming from. Because by saying, I'm right about this, these are the facts, I think that what a lot of debates lack, and I think a lot of what of these conversations with people of opposing viewpoints lack is, okay, so now where do you and I meet? Can we bridge the gap somewhere? So what's the solution here then? I think we should do this. Okay, great. No, I don't see that. And I really think that's it, because it's one thing to shout facts all day, even to SJWs, right? Where there's no like, what's the point? Okay, so I'm wrong. Where do we go from here? We don't bridge the gap enough. And I don't know.
I would argue that I think there's actually too much argument about policy and not enough discussion about the underlying ideologies and philosophies, because policies, I mean, honestly, policy is kind of boring. Like, if we agree that it's illegal to steal people's land for the, like, let's just say we agree philosophically that the government shouldn't take people's land. Okay, that might affect a bunch of policies we're talking about, and that belief would drive our opinions about different proposals. But having the discussion about those proposals and what's best without having the underlying discussion about the belief system. And, you know, when I see social justice isn't a political ideology fundamentally. It's a philosophical ideology that's based on collectivism, which you've said. And it seems like the discussion really needs to be about collectivism. Like, are you an individual first, or are you a member of a bunch of categories? And can you get treated as just a group, or do you need to be treated as an individual? Like, what is social justice? And it seems to me like that's not a conversation that college campuses are having. They're taking the ideology as, or that they're taking the philosophy as given, and then they're kind of wanting to argue about policy, which is like, I don't know. You're arguing about what color to paint the house, but you haven't picked a site to build it on yet.
Yeah, I think that that's a good point with when we talk about just Americans as a whole, because in a strange way, one could make the argument that when you are making any kind of policy, there's a degree of collectivism behind it, right? I think that the difference
you could make that argument.
Right, you can make the argument that our politicians, regardless of whether they're conservative or otherwise, make decisions based on collective well-being of everyone. So I think the issue here is to be able to go between the lines a little bit, and weirdly enough, not necessarily create laws that, or even ways of thinking where one group benefits more at the expense of another, right? And the thing is, unfortunately, that's an impossible system, because when we look at how people are, and people's advantages and disadvantages are all unevenly distributed with very little regard to do with race, national origin, gender, whatever it may be, in a weird way, it's like the collectivist laws don't really work, right? I think as long as we can agree that we don't want to infringe on anybody's individual rights, this is where more of the libertarian philosophy comes in, where it's like, as long as you are not taking my stuff and you are not in some way violating my individualism or my property rights, then you're free to do what you want. I can see that working, but you know what I mean? I think determining overall groupthink for just whatever group of people you claim membership to, and that can go on and on and on, is not always the best approach. And I see where you're coming from with that. Something that I'd have to think about a little bit more. It hasn't really crossed my mind too much.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at how what makes America unique, or what did make America unique at its foundation, it was a product of the Enlightenment. And the thing that was different about the Enlightenment was this shift in philosophically from the idea that kings or leaders would manage what was, quote, best for the kingdom or the groups collectively, And the idea was shifted to actually there is no such thing as group collective good. And really the role of the government should just be to protect individuals and let the chips fall where they may, protect them from violating each other's rights.
Right.
Now, strict libertarians and anarcho-capitalists will have issues with some implementations of that in and of itself as not as self-contradictory, but that was kind of the seed of America, and it's interesting. It was interesting to me that when you just said like, oh, that's what our politicians do. They make decisions based on the collective good of people, but that's not what they used to do in America. It is everywhere else in the world, basically, but that's not. This country was not founded on that idea, really. The thing that made it different was they're not supposed to do that.
And you're right. I think that the founders never intended for the government to get as big as it is today. You know, that's just true. I believe personally, not that this is something that needs to be exercised in America, that the government only really needs to be around to enforce the laws, right? So that people aren't, because you can't have absolute freedom. That would be anarchy. And obviously your society would fall apart. We're a constitutional republic. And I think that the government needs to be there to enforce the laws, make sure that people aren't taking each other's stuff and killing each other, for one thing, and be there to take care of the elderly, the mentally ill, and the sick. And that's it. Everything else that people can handle. I really think that that's the only reason our government should exist, for just those two purposes. The rest will take care of itself. If we truly want to reap the benefits of a free market capitalist society and not harbor so much about collectivist groupthink, that's what I think. And I think that is what the founders intended, as far as what in their day and age they were classical liberals, but that is the purest form of conservatism, because it's just like, well, we're just here to make sure you guys don't go off the rails, but we're not here to tax the hell out of you or have a Department of Education, determining how education should be run, or all these healthcare programs that just impose more strict regulations that don't foster as much room for innovation. And that's what I think. I think it needs to be more limited, and that's where me and a lot of small government advocates would stand by. Yeah, I hope that makes sense.
Certainly what you describe is a lot closer to how the country started.
It is. I'm a constitutional conservative. That's what I like. If I were to, that's what I look at. And I think it was right. Like, I don't really see the need to progress beyond that. I think that anything that kind of gave the government more power was a regression. It was a step away. Like, it was already working. Why did we have to fix it? There were a couple of reasons, and not for any real reasons for the people, but more just because one group of Americans were fed up and didn't like the idea. The two biggest points in history were Reconstruction and civil rights. Those two eras. Yeah. Before that, it was fine. It was fine the way it was, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I think we could have a whole discussion about why things ran off the rails and that kind of thing. But what would you, just looping back to your Walkaway experience and your experience in college, what would you tell, I'm not so old that my daughter's getting ready to go to college, but sooner than I'd like. I'll have to start worrying about that. What would you tell a parent who, look, a lot of parents, they haven't been in college for 20 years. So they have no idea, or longer. What would you tell them about sending their kids to college and what they should worry about, if anything? Or would you just say, go, don't worry about it, it's crazy? But
I think the bigger question here is, what are you looking to get out of college? I think the option to partake in higher education is no longer necessary, but it does depend on what your child wants. I would ask them that question first, like, what are you looking to get out of it? If it's just simply to pursue something that's more ideological, that doesn't really require a higher education, then I actually would advise against it. I don't think you get your return on investment, honestly, being somebody who has just gone through the ringer. But that being said, if they do feel the need to want to interact with like-minded individuals, which I think is more of an incentive for a lot of young people as opposed to what they're actually learning, then by all means encourage that. But then also be open to fostering honest and healthy discussions with people, regardless of what could happen. And I say that with a grain of salt, just because I know that the consequences for free speech right now is not always great. But at the same time, you don't want people to not be honest with themselves. You know, I think really it's been nothing but rewarding for me. You know, people will find their own, but it's all about what they want to get out of it. Like, honestly, if they're not going for something that's going to, that you like, you can't really be a doctor unless you go to school.
Right.
Then that's one thing. But if it's just, you know, something that you could utilize the best skills of your own and do your own self-learning, I don't think it's 100% necessary.
So can you get that interaction with like-minded people at college if you're not, can you safely get like-minded interacting with like-minded people if you're not on the extreme left or the authoritarian left?
You know what? I that's interesting that you asked that, because I think that there's a bigger problem here with just discussions as a whole, regardless of whether you're leftist or right. I find that people just don't talk to each other very much anymore. Like, I know people that just came out of the university system was like, dude, I made no friends in 4 years. I mean, like, I had friends, but we were so isolated in some weird way. And I think that has a lot to do with the inability to foster discussion, for one thing. And, you know, you could blame it on a variety of different mediums, such as, you know, we've become very interconnected, but yet very isolated as well. I'm sorry, what was your question? Kind of just went off on a tangent.
No, I was just asking if you actually can have that experience of interacting with like-minded people and finding them and talking and connecting at college, if you can even really safely have that if you're not on the authoritarian left.
I think so, but I think that it can't be framed in a way whereas it's so authoritative where you just alienate people. Like, this is what I believe and I'm not budging whatsoever. I think it should be.
But if 18-year-old kid goes to college in San Francisco or Oakland or somewhere in the U.S. and they start telling people at parties like, "Oh, I'd really like to talk about healthcare, and I think maybe we should have less government involvement in healthcare system," or maybe I want to talk about I'm not really so sure about this white privilege thing. Will they be able to find like-minded people, or will they just get destroyed?
I think they will. Because there's a whole, as many, like, kids are bright, like, as many people are that have already subscribed to that way of thinking. There's also a ton of people who are just quiet about beliefs that are going to be otherwise. Like, SJWs are all over campus, but I'm happy to say that they're not a big percentage. Like, you know, if you did a real college survey of a lot of students, it's like only the loudest of the 17% that are SJWs. Really, like, you know,
that's really interesting. That's good to know. So they're very loud, but you don't think they're pervasive. It's not everywhere.
They're very loud, so you think that they're prominent, but they're not the majority. So, you know,
but they keep everyone else quiet. Yeah, everyone else is afraid. Like, there was a study done that said that over 50% of college kids are afraid to speak their mind.
Yeah,
that's because the orthodoxy on college campuses is SJW, but it is encouraging to think that that's just because they're the loudest. Just like the fact that they run the media, they run entertainment, they run academia. It doesn't necessarily mean that they make up most of the left. It's just that they are very loud and they have great influence, and they steer where things are going.
Right.
They keep other people quiet.
How do we fix that, guys?
Hey, man, let me help you out. You need a ride to school? All right, let's talk. Oh, you feel differently? Well, it shouldn't matter. We're friends, aren't we? That's how we do it. Not by shoving my beliefs down your throat. Just be a friend to somebody first. Even if they're a purple-haired feminist, I'm sure she's going through something weird. But, like, if you're a friend to that person first, like, I would like to think that if they are not so far gone, they will be willing to have a discussion with you. And I think that we can follow that example from people who take a little bit more of a diplomatic approach. But, you know, that's the thing in college, is like, meet people, just be friendly, but don't go into it like I have to be right all the time. These are my beliefs and none others. So yeah. So
that's good advice. And maybe if it turns out that person rejects your friendship just because of that, well, then you've identified They're
Correct.
part of that small group of people who are crazy SJWs and they're a lost cause. But you're saying there's a vast majority of people who will be totally fine to have that discussion.
Yes.
Well, that's encouraging, Zach.
Well, that's all I can say. I mean, I'm also a very optimistic person, so it's, I'd like to think that people are nice.
Yeah. So I don't know if you have to go. We're rounding out. We're getting at the end of the hour here. By the way, to anyone who is starting to join, sorry we went an hour early today because we screwed up our times and had scheduling conflict, so ended up going live early. Yeah, I don't. Do you have to go, or can we keep going? Because I don't want to keep you. I don't want to be rude. I know you have an appointment.
I do have to go. I have a call I have to take. But
all right.
This has been thoroughly productive, and thank you for having me on here, Carter and Keri.
Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for coming on, Zach. Really appreciate it. And
let's continue.
We'll have to have you back. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, let's continue this dialogue. You have my contact information, so feel free to reach out at any point, and we'll talk soon.
All right, absolutely. Take care.
All right, thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Later.
Thanks, Keri.
So, Keri, we've got Keri left. Oh well. I was going to say we've got a couple people coming in. Yes, Jason, you missed it. So Laura and Jason just joined. We had to go live early because there was a scheduling issue. So sorry about that. Anyway, thank you all for watching. And if you're just joining now, you can rewind and watch it. But you can follow us at Twitter at Unsafe Space Co. You can go to unsafespace.co, not .com, but .co. The M stands for Marxism, so we don't have any of that here. And where else? YouTube.com/unsafespace. Oh, there's Keri.
Sorry.
I was wrapping up the show because I was like, well, Keri abandoned me, so
I hit the wrong button.
Keri's back. Forget everything I said. You can still like and follow the show, but you don't have to stop now. Yeah, Art. So for people who are just joining, we went an hour early. Apologize for that, but we had a scheduling conflict at the last minute that was discovered, and so our guest had to go an hour early, and we chose to just do that instead of I don't know, talking without. Oh, Siri has something to say. I'm not listening to the music app, Siri. So that was a good discussion, Keri. Do you have anything to add about the Walkaway movement on campus? I didn't realize that 50% of the kids didn't feel like they could express they're afraid to express their viewpoints.
Yeah, I'll put the link in the comment section. I'll find it. It was a study I read about. Yeah, over half of college kids self-reported said that they are afraid of stating their opinions. And then, so you have to assume a lot of those are liberals because most college kids are liberals. So there's a lot of liberals who are afraid of speaking.
I also, wasn't there something that was like a third of the kids didn't really believe in free speech anymore or something like that? There was some study related to that as well. So
possibly.
I don't know. Yeah, it's getting pretty crazy. So, Keri, the reason I wanted to kind of do a final ending thing, I didn't know if you wanted to talk about Jussie. So
I would, but
if you want to, we could do it another time if we don't need to. So,
I tried while we were on. I scheduled a doctor's appointment since we went early, so I do have to go.
All right, that's fine. So this was just like a really bad ending to a show. But Keri got to. Why don't you give an ending, Keri? Why don't you do the sign off and say goodbye? That can be your job today.
Thanks for joining us, guys. We'll see you later.
That was very well done.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.